A successful, polite, and respected black CEO was asked to leave his VIP seat just to give it to a white passenger with less privileges. No clear explanation, no apology, just a cold look and awkward silence. But what made people choke was not the moment he stood up, but the look he gave the entire cabin, calm, without resistance, but full of the familiarity of those who had experienced injustice. Have you ever experienced that feeling? The feeling of being overlooked, of being misjudged because of something you can't change? If it were you, would you walk away silently like him? Or would you stand up and confront? Would you choose dignity or safety? And what if that choice changed the lives of dozens of people over the next few minutes? This story will touch the deepest corners of self-esteem, pain, and hope that we sometimes forget. We invite you to join us on this journey with gentleness and honesty. If you find the story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on stories that touch your heart. The light at Denver International Airport was different that afternoon. The late afternoon sun shone through thick glass, casting golden streaks across the clean tile of the most upscale lounge, the LuxPort Elite Lounge. The place was quiet, a world apart, a steaming cup of black coffee, the faint scent of cinnamon wafting from the pastry counter, the slow rolling of suitcase wheels, all created an atmosphere of serenity, so peaceful that one could forget that outside was a bustling airport. In a quiet corner near the large window, Thomas M. Carter was reading the book he always carried with him when traveling. The cover was a little worn, but Thomas liked the feeling old, simple, like himself. His eyes quietly followed each line of words, but his gaze was not really on the page. It was hovering somewhere among the streaks of sunlight falling on the airport, where people were bustling but still very human. Thomas is 52 years old. His skin is the color of walnut, warm, strong, the color that has made him learn to tread carefully in society since childhood. People know him as the CEO of Ether Air, the leading aviation group in the United States, a man of no small influence in the industry. But here, today, Thomas does not want to carry that power. He is traveling alone, without an assistant, without an escort, and does not want anyone to bow to him. It is simply a business trip arranged in 2 days, and he wants a few minutes of peace before boarding Ether Air Infinity First. A ticket he paid nearly $1,200 for just a quiet space. Perhaps because he wasn't wearing the platinum halo badge, the symbol that America's richest people still use as an invisible business card, no one in the lounge paid much attention to him. A light gray jacket, time-worn leather shoes, a straight but gentle posture. Looking at him, people could only guess that he was a gentle, middle-aged man, a little tired from work. Thomas loved that. He always said, "When people don't see your power, you really see who they are." Every so often, Thomas's eyes would leave the page and look out at the runway stretching out in the distance. A giant plane was being prepared for another flight, the last rays of sunlight shining on its shiny metal. The image reminded him of his childhood, standing behind the fence of the old airport in Atlanta, watching planes take off like dreams of flying. He was just a skinny black boy, wearing his brother's old t-shirt, and his friends always laughed at him for being black and dreaming of flying. There are wounds that never heal completely, but they are also what make Thomas the man he is today, calm, strong from the inside. He doesn't need to prove anything, just be true to himself. A waiter walked by, smiling politely. Thomas nodded in response, slightly but warmly. He was always like that, slow, attentive, unassuming, but that silence was about to be torn apart in a few minutes. Near the reception area, the sound of high heels rang out urgently, followed by a slightly sharp but familiar voice of someone who was too used to being served. "Honey, who did they let sit in our seats?" Thomas looked up slightly and saw a couple enter. They were dressed well, a tall, white man in his early 50s, and a woman wearing sunglasses so large they covered half her face. The way they stood, the way they looked around with scrutinizing eyes, was enough to show that they were used to others giving way. Thomas sighed. gently closing the book to keep it in place. He had lived long enough to recognize the telltale signs of an unpleasant situation. His intuition, the same intuition that had helped him scale dozens of layers of airline prejudice, was starting to speak. He asked himself, "Am I prepared for an uncomfortable conversation?" Part of him wanted to get up, to leave, to get away from the troubles he understood better than anyone. But another part whispered, "No, Thomas, you have as much right to be here as anyone." A gentle breeze blew from the air conditioning system. A few magazines on the table fluttered. Something in the air had changed. Not because Thomas did anything wrong, but because the world sometimes just needs to see the color of his skin. The loudspeaker in the lounge blared a soft boarding announcement, but the couple's footsteps and questioning eyes were already turning toward Thomas. He knew something big was coming, but he sat there, his hands clasped over the book, his eyes calm, his breathing soft. The calm before the storm is always the most beautiful moment, but also the most fragile. And at that moment, in a few short minutes, Thomas Carter had absolutely no idea that in just 5 minutes, an entire team of staff from the LuxPort Elite Lounge would be fired just because of the action they were about to commit against him. The storm was still far away, but the wind had changed direction. The atmosphere in the LuxPort Elite Lounge was already quiet, but the appearance of the couple seemed to make the whole room stop. The gazes of the people scattered in the lounge swept towards them, then turned to Thomas, as if there was an undeniable contrast between the two images. One was ostentatious luxury, the other was calm simplicity. Thomas was used to that kind of look. He had learned since childhood to be calm in the face of wordless judgment, but no matter how familiar he was, every time he saw it again, a corner of him still ached, a very slight, very deep ache, like an invisible scar that occasionally reminded him that it was still there. A lounge attendant approached, a slightly forced smile on his face. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was the kind of smile someone tries to be polite to, but doesn't quite acknowledge your presence. The smile doesn't quite reach the eyes. Sir, the clerk named Sophia said, her voice trying to be gentle. "Are you sure this is your correct seat?" Thomas slowly raised his head and replied in a warm and calm voice, "Yes. I wrote it clearly on the ticket." He opened his wallet, took out his boarding pass, and handed it to Sophia. But something strange happened. She looked at the pass for exactly 1 second. No scanning, no checking the system. Just glanced at it and handed it back as if everything had been predetermined. Sophia said quickly, "Yes, but there might be a slight mistake, because this area is usually reserved for Platinum Halo guests or guests with special requests." Thomas kept a small smile on his face, but his heart sank. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that kind of argument. Since becoming CEO of Ether Air, he'd tried to maintain a low profile, dressed simply, and sometimes that simplicity had given people the wrong impression of him. He asked again, his voice still calm. "Have you checked?" Sophia paused for a moment. Yes, sir. I just thought, you think someone like me can't buy this ticket?" The question wasn't harsh. It didn't smell of anger. It was soft as silk, but it really confused Sophia. She avoided Thomas's gaze and stammered, "That's not what I meant, sir. It's just, I guess." Thomas repeated the word breathlessly. People are good at guessing. In that moment, Thomas realized 2 things. Sophia wasn't a bad person, but she was a product of a system that looked at her appearance and immediately fit into a pre-existing mold, a system that he, even as CEO, was trying to change, little by little. The Prescott's shoes sounded behind her, making Sophia almost stand up straighter. Evan Prescott spoke up in the authoritative voice of someone used to being served. "Sophia, what's going on? Why is private circle number 3 occupied?" Sophia turned to them as if searching for a lifeline. "Mr. Prescott, I'm taking care of it right now." Linda Prescott looked Thomas up and down. It wasn't a look of doubt. It was an assessment, a judgment, a conclusion before facts. "I knew it," she said, not even lowering her voice. the type who never belonged in this area. Thomas heard it clearly. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air rush through his chest. For a moment, he remembered his teenage years, the first time he was chased away by a mall security guard for standing too close to a luxury goods counter, and he remembered the feeling, shame, anger, but powerless because he didn't have the strength to fight back. He had grown. He had been through so much. But why did moments like this always find a way to come back? Sophia looked at Thomas, then at Prescott, then made a decision faster than she could think, "Sir. I think you should move to the other area to ensure the comfort of the VIP guests." "And I'm not a VIP?" Thomas asked again, still not raising his voice. "You don't look like it," Sophia blurted out, then immediately covered her mouth, knowing she had said something wrong. Thomas was silent. The words were familiar, but they still cut him every time. He put the book down. He looked up at Sophia, not with anger, a very human look, tired, sad, but full of dignity. "Miss Sophia," Thomas said softly, "I'm asking you this. If I were white, would you check more carefully?" No one said anything. Even Evan and Linda paused, as if the question held something larger than themselves. In a split second, the truth was revealed in the air. Sophia knew the answer. Thomas knew it. Everyone else standing there knew it. Sophia swallowed, trying to avoid his gaze. "I apologize, sir, but I must ask you to move seats according to regulations, rules, a handy word to cover all prejudices." Thomas looked at the boarding pass in his hand. Clear, valid, high price, right in the VIP section. But all of that suddenly became less important than the fact that people believed he didn't belong there. A sudden wave of emotion welled up inside him, not anger, but disappointment. Disappointment that after all these years of working, trying, overcoming obstacles, he still had to face this. But Thomas Carter was not the type to run away. He asked slowly, "Do you really want me to get up and leave?" Sophia took a breath, then nodded slightly. "Yes. To avoid causing trouble for other guests, hard for other guests." Thomas suddenly felt a little bitter. Evan's face relaxed as if he had just won a battle without having to fight. Linda crossed her arms smugly and glanced at Thomas with a look that clearly said, "That's right. Know your place." Thomas felt it, but he did not react. He had learned not to let the contempt of others determine his worth. He stood up softly, picked up the book, so gently that it made no sound. But before leaving his chair, he tilted his head to look at Sophia and said something that made her face pale. "You really should scan my ticket. It only takes 3 seconds." The words were not harsh, but they weighed like a stone dropped on a lake, sending ripples that spread far and wide. Sophia did not fully understand them, but she sensed something bigger was coming. Thomas walked away. Unbeknownst to anyone, he was holding a storm inside. The storm has been sleeping for a long time, and it's about to wake up. The breeze in the lounge blew gently, but it wasn't the air that had changed. But it was the fate of those who chose to look at the color of his skin instead of the truth right before their eyes. But they don't know that yet. They just know. They kicked a black man out of his own seat. 5 more minutes they will pay, many times more than they thought, so urgent that none of them had time to prepare. The atmosphere in the LuxPort Elite Lounge became thick as soon as Thomas left his chair, not because anyone spoke loudly, but because of the strange silence that enveloped the space, like a thin mist that someone had just released into the middle of the room. Curious eyes were furtively observing, as if afraid of being caught, but unable to leave the scene unfolding before them. As Thomas walked into the less privileged waiting area, his shoes made a soft click on the polished wooden floor. He felt a sense of loss with every step, a lingering question. Why was what was so easy for others to give so hard for him? But then, as he had always done in his life, he swallowed the feeling deep down, letting it lie still like a stone at the bottom of a pond. On the opposite side, couple Evan and Linda Prescott were walking to private circle number 3, looking as if the entire airport had been built just for them. Evan Prescott, a real estate entrepreneur, has a slight round belly from fancy dinners and tailored suits. At 52, he has the air of someone more accustomed to giving orders than demands. Linda, who wears large black glasses that obscure her expression, has the confident walk of someone who makes sure she is the center of attention in any room. Linda rolled down her window just enough to glance at the chair Thomas had vacated, then turned to her husband. "I told you, Evan. If we were a little late, they'd put the wrong person in here." Evan hummed, his voice low but possessive. It was a system error, but luckily it was resolved. Sophia, the staff member, stood nearby, trying to maintain a professional smile despite her fingers tightening on the small notebook in her hand. She turned to Prescott, bowing slightly. "Hello, Mr. Prescott and Mrs. Prescott. Everything has been arranged as requested." Linda nodded as if it were a given. She placed the large designer bag on the table, exactly where Thomas had left his book. The sight of it made Sophia feel even more pressured, though she herself didn't understand why she felt so burdened. Evan pulled out a chair and sat down, then suddenly glanced at the area where Thomas was waiting, even though they were quite far away. Evan could still judge Thomas's demeanor just by the straight back and the way his eyes were looking at the runway. He curled his lips meaningfully. "It's unbelievable. Someone like that even entered the private circle." Linda laughed. A dry, unsubtle laugh. "I don't think it's strange. Everyone wants to show off these days, but he certainly doesn't look the part." The words were like a small knife cutting through the air. Sophia heard every word clearly, and even though she had never thought deeply about what she had said to Thomas, at this moment she felt her face burning, partly from embarrassment, partly from intuition. Something was wrong. But the pressure from the Prescotts made her not have the courage to go check Thomas's boarding pass as he had suggested. Sophia felt two emotions competing in her heart. One was the duty to serve the VIP. The other was the strange feeling when she remembered Thomas's calm but sad eyes. That look, for some reason, made her feel heavy. While Sophia was busy struggling internally, Evan called out, "Sophia, bring me an iced scotch. An 18-year-old. Linda interrupted, "And I want a cappuccino. Not too hot." The tone was commanding. There was no room for delay. Sophia quickly turned away, leaving an empty space where the Prescott couple began talking to each other as if no one was around. "I've known the owner of this lounge for a long time," Evan said, his voice full of arrogance. "I don't like any chaos happening here." Linda sneered. "Disorderly, I think that's a weak word. Look again. There are people who can change the atmosphere for the worse just by walking in." Thomas caught the words, even from a distance. He didn't need to hear them to understand. You don't have to shout to discriminate. Sometimes a look is enough. Thomas took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his mother as a young woman. "Never let anyone take away your composure just because you're black," she had said to him in their old house in Atlanta. "Your composure is your most powerful weapon." Thomas opened his eyes. The late afternoon light was as golden as ever. But what had changed was his thoughts. He no longer felt pushed from his chair. He saw clearly what was happening. Prejudice wasn't coming from one person. It was coming from a group of people who had never put themselves in someone else's shoes. And he, a black man who had risen to the top of one of America's largest corporations, understood better than anyone. Sometimes you have to calmly stand up for the truth, not for yourself, but for those who don't have the strength to do so. But Thomas was in no hurry. He knew that everything came in its time. Life had taught him that. While he was pondering, Sophia dropped her spoon at the bar when the bartender asked her, "Are you sure he changed seats? I noticed his boarding pass was a different color." Sophia blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" The bartender shrugged. "I noticed that color only appears on the tickets of the highest class passengers." Sophia stood still, her spine chilled. She swallowed. A thought entered her head, a thought that made her legs freeze. What if she was wrong? What if he really was a big VIP? What if This was about to explode in a way she couldn't imagine. She turned to look at Thomas, who was still standing there, staring out at the runway. No complaints, no anger, but the silence itself made her shiver. And just then, the lounge door opened with a very soft sound. A security guard entered, followed by an assistant from the airport operations office. Their faces were serious. Thomas saw it, and in a split second, he knew the moment when everything would turn was here. Just a few more minutes, the storm would no longer be in his heart. It will sweep away all who have touched his dignity with contempt. As the security guard and the executive office assistant entered, a new air filled the LuxPort Elite Lounge. It wasn't a commotion, but a kind of silence that was noticeable. The people scattered around the room looked up, but only for a moment, then looked back down at their phones or drinks, as if they didn't want to get involved in the big picture, but they knew something was about to happen. Everyone felt it. Thomas stood in the corner of the lounge, looking out at the runway with the air of a man in no hurry. He knew one thing: when the world starts to turn against you, let it. Calmness was the one key he never lost. Meanwhile, in the VIP area, lounge manager Brett Coleman had just returned from the back room. Brett was in his early 40s, wearing a dark blue suit, his tie tied so tight it was almost constricting. When he saw the Prescott couple seated in private circle number 3, Brett flashed a smug smile, as if everything was going exactly as he wanted. Sophia was the complete opposite. From the moment the bartender mentioned Thomas's unusual ticket color, she couldn't stop looking at him. Every time her eyes drifted to the man, she felt a string tightening around her chest. Her intuition had never been stronger. Sophia knew one thing: if she was wrong, the consequences could be dire. Brett approached the Prescott couple, his voice full of service, but also a little flattering. "We apologize for the inconvenience. We've already dealt with the other person." Linda raised her head, her lips curving up in satisfaction. "Good. I told you. This place needs stricter management." Evan patted Brett on the shoulder, almost too familiarly. "You did well. High-class lounges like this have standards. Norm, a word with many layers of meaning, and often used to mask prejudices that no one dares to speak directly." At that moment, Sophia approached Brett, lowering her voice. "Brett, I think we should check the ticket of that guest earlier." "There might have been a mistake," Brett interrupted, not bothering to listen to the rest of the sentence. "What's wrong? Can't you see what he's like? Just looking at him, you can tell he's not platinum halo." "But..." Sophia swallowed as Brett waved his hand. "No buts. Just do as I say." Those words were like a slash of scissors that cut off the conscience that was speaking in Sophia. She stood still, her hands clenched tightly around herself, her feeling of unease growing. Not far from them was Thomas, who was watching everything with a look that was both calm and understanding. He knew what kind of man Brett was. He had met people like Brett all his life, people who believed that their small power was a privilege, and that privilege allowed them to judge others without thinking. But what Thomas didn't know was that Brett had left a bigger crack than he thought. Brett then walked toward airport security. His face was full of confidence. "Thanks for coming. Damien, I think we have a guest who's been a little disruptive, but I've taken care of him. Just make sure he doesn't go back into the VIP area." Damien, the security guard, looked at Brett with a strange look. He was sure he hadn't heard anything, but he saw something Brett hadn't behind him. The executive assistant was talking urgently into the walkie-talkie. Sophia watched, her heart sinking even further. She wanted to tell Brett that something was wrong, to tell him not to jump to conclusions. But Brett wasn't the type to stop and listen. He was used to making decisions and expecting the world to follow suit. Damien walked over to Thomas. Before he could say anything, Thomas looked at him and nodded. "I guess someone told you I wasn't allowed in the VIP area." Damien was a little surprised. "Yes, sir. I was just checking the information." "It's okay." Thomas interrupted, but his voice was gentle. "I understand." Brett watched the scene from afar and smiled triumphantly. In his mind, everything was already set. No doubts, no consideration, no need for further information, but Brett had no idea that in just a minute, everything he believed to be certain would turn to dust. As Damien was about to ask more, the executive assistant, Marcus Hill, walked quickly towards them. His face was serious, his executive office badge swinging against his chest. "Thomas Carter Marcus," said, his voice almost trembling. "Mr. Carter, are you really Thomas M.?" Carter Brett heard the name from behind him. He frowned, trying to place it somewhere. It sounded familiar, but his brain couldn't quite connect the dots. Damien turned to Marcus. "You know him?" Marcus didn't answer the question. He looked straight at Thomas with undisguised respect. "Sir, the board was notified that you were in the lounge. We apologize for not being prepared." The room fell into a cold silence. Thomas just nodded slightly. "No problem." Brett felt the back of his neck burn. That name. Why did it sound so familiar? Sophia stood there, frozen. Her face was white. Her heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. Evan and Linda Prescott didn't notice. Linda even laughed. "Oh, a fan." Only Thomas understood what was happening, and he knew. This was just the beginning. Marcus adjusted his radio. "Management is on its way here now. They're asking all lounge staff to stand down. Brett, Damien, you guys need to stand by while we investigate an emergency involving the highest-ranking passenger, highest-class passenger." The words fell to the floor like a heavy stone. Brett froze, his mouth slightly open, but no sound came out. Sophia whispered in despair, "Oh my God." And Evan finally started to feel uneasy. He put his glass down on the table, eyeing Marcus suspiciously. "Wait, the highest ranking, you mean?" Marcus didn't look at him. He looked at Thomas. Thomas still stood there, his eyes calm, his voice low but sharp as clear glass. "I told you, Sophia," he said softly. "It only takes 3 seconds to scan my ticket." The whole room seemed to freeze. Sophia covered her mouth, almost crying. Brett stood there, frozen. Evan and Linda looked at each other with worried eyes. No one was prepared for what was about to happen. No one. And when the lounge door swung open again, signaling the arrival of the senior executives, Thomas sensed something others hadn't yet understood. The moment of justice has come to the door, and no one can run away from it. The automatic door of the LuxPort Elite Lounge opened again. This time it was not the customers or the waiters, but 3 people in neat black suits who walked in. Their appearance made the whole room feel tight. The air became thick, so quiet that you could clearly hear the slight hum of the air conditioning system. Leading the way was Rebecca Owens, Executive Vice President of Customer Service for Horizon Airlink. She was followed by Harold Kim, Human Resources Director for the Central Region, and finally Jenna Morales, Senior Legal Counsel for the airline. With every step they took, Brett felt as if the ground beneath his feet were slipping away. Sophia stood behind the counter, struggling to breathe. Evan and Linda Prescott, who always thought the world revolved around them, sat still as statues. Rebecca Owens's eyes scanned the lounge before stopping on Thomas. Her gaze changed, in a split second, from cold to genuine respect. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low but commanding. "We deeply apologize for this unacceptable incident." Linda Prescott frowned. "What happened? That man sat in my VIP seat by mistake." Rebecca turned to look at Linda. Her gaze was so serious it could mute an airplane engine. "Mrs. Prescott, please be quiet until we get this cleared up." Linda was stunned, as if she couldn't believe anyone would dare say that to her in this space that was her playground of power. Meanwhile, Brett, who had always been confident in his control of the lounge, was now caught between 2 gazes, one from Rebecca and one from Thomas. 2 different gazes, but with one thing in common, they knew exactly what he had done. Rebecca turned back to Thomas, placing her hand on her chest in a formal gesture of apology that high-level service people rarely actually used. "Mr. Carter, We received a priority signal from the operations office just 3 minutes ago. If we had known you were here, the entire lounge would have been prepared to a different standard." Thomas smiled slightly, as if he were used to this kind of reaction. "It's nothing. Rebecca, I'm just waiting for my flight. No need to be so tense." But it was precisely this calmness that made Rebecca feel even more ashamed. A man of Thomas's status treated this serious transgression with the attitude of someone who had experienced it too many times. Thomas said nothing more. He wanted them to figure out what had happened and deal with it. Rebecca turned to the employee. "Brett Coleman, Sophia Lee, come here." Brett stepped forward, his legs shaking so much he had to brace himself to keep his balance. Sophia followed behind, her heart feeling like it was hanging in her chest, ready to fall at any moment. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Who asked Mr. Carter to leave his rightful seat?" Brett swallowed. "I just followed the lounge rules. Diamond privilege has priority." "That's not the rule," Rebecca interrupted. "Diamond status cannot replace Skymaster Elite. Never. You should know that." Brett fell silent. He had never seen a Skymaster Elite ticket in person, let alone its owner. Sophia spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. I saw the ticket. It was a different color, but..." Sophia stopped. She felt Thomas's eyes on her, not accusing but piercing her conscience. Rebecca said in a low voice, "Skymaster Elite is the highest level of Horizon Airlink. Holders of this ticket are typically senior investors, strategic board members, or partners who have made special contributions to the system." Then she looked straight at Brett. "Do you know who he is?" Brett forced himself to look composed. First-class passenger. Rebecca shook her head. "No, he's someone this company owes more than anyone here understands. And I'm not talking about money." Linda Prescott laughed. "Oh, come on. Are you saying he's a big shot at the company?" Rebecca turned, her eyes daggers. "Not just big, Mrs. Prescott. He oversaw the entire strategic restructuring of Horizon Airlink last year. Without him, the airline would not be able to maintain its current international routes. And his presence in any of our facilities must be treated as a special priority." The whole lounge was in shock. Evan Prescott turned to his wife, his eyes wide. Linda paled. The arrogant smile vanished as if it had never existed. Meanwhile, Brett almost collapsed on the spot. But that's not the most important thing. Rebecca continued. She looked directly at Thomas, then turned back and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Thomas Carter is not just a strategic partner. He is a key member of the investment committee of Summit Ascend Capital, which owns 18% of Horizon Airlink." No one can breathe. A heavy silence fell over the room. Evan stuttered, "You mean he sort of co-owns the airline?" "Exactly," Rebecca replied curtly. The air was tense to the point of suffocation. Linda looked at Thomas, her mouth open but unable to say a word. Her eyes showed both fear and utter shock when she realized that the person she had just kicked out of the VIP seat had the power to kick the entire world out of this airline if he wanted to. Brett gasped. "Mr. Carter, I don't know. If I knew..." Thomas raised his hand gently. "There's no need to say anything, Brett, because if you're only nice to me when you know who I am, that just proves the point." That simple statement struck a chord more than any scolding, because it was the plain truth. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I need to review all footage from the lounge over the last 30 minutes. We need to determine the extent of the violation." Harold, the HR manager, opened his laptop and quickly flipped through the video files. A few seconds later, the sound from the video echoed through the room. Linda Prescott finally... Someone cleared a seat for the right person. Brett Coleman. "Don't worry, Mrs. Prescott. I'll take care of that person right away." Sophia. Brett. "Maybe we should check our tickets first." Brett. "No need. This seat isn't for regular class." Then came the sentence that froze the room. Linda Prescott. "There are no places for people like him." Rebecca's expression changed. Harold frowned. And Jenna, the legal advisor, put her laptop down on the table, her seriousness so obvious it made Sophia choke. Thomas stood there, silent. He didn't watch the video. He just observed each human reaction. Rebecca turned to Brett. "Brett, you are suspended, effective immediately. An internal investigation will be opened." Sophia turned pale. Brett was speechless, his face drained of blood. Linda Prescott jumped up. "Wait, you can't use that video." Jenna looked straight at her. "We absolutely can. And Horizon will not tolerate discrimination, whether by employees or passengers." Linda was stunned. I've been a Diamond Privilege customer for 12 years. I put my money into this company." Rebecca's answer was soft, but cold as steel in the Colorado winter, and Mr. Carter gave more than you. A lot. Linda sat down, trembling. Thomas stood there, strangely silent. No anger, no revenge, just the serenity of someone who had seen too many times how he had been misjudged because of the color of his skin. Rebecca turned to him again. "Mr. Carter, please tell us, how do you want to handle this?" Thomas looked around the room. The guilty faces, the frightened eyes, the shaking hands. A moment that seemed endless. He took a slow breath. "Just do it the way you do. Rebecca. Nothing more, nothing less." In that moment, no one knew what normal meant to Thomas, but they are about to find out, and the price to pay will be heavier than they think. The atmosphere inside the LuxPort Elite Lounge was like standing in the eye of a storm. All sound seemed to be drawn into an invisible void, except for the erratic breathing of a few people and the faint sound of Jenna's laptop turning pages. Rebecca stood before Thomas with all the respect she could muster, but she still didn't dare sit, didn't dare lower herself into a chair, as if any misstep now might be a long downfall in her career. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low but tense, "you want to proceed as usual." "What do you mean?" Thomas looked around the room. His eyes lingered on each face. Brett was ashen. Sophia bowed her head, her hands clasped together in front of her as if ready to admit her mistake. Evan Prescott stared down at his drink, his pride gone. Linda was too shocked to look at anyone. He answered slowly, his voice so calm it sent shivers down the room. "Normal. I want you to handle it exactly according to your airline's regulations. No special privileges, no exceptions, no additions or subtractions." Harold, the HR manager, turned to Rebecca as if to confirm that he had heard correctly. Jenna, the legal advisor, raised an eyebrow. Damien straightened his back, as if this had come as a surprise. Thomas continued, "I don't want this to become a personal vendetta. I don't want you to make unnecessary noise because of who I am. I want you to do the right thing, as if the person who was wrong today was anyone else." The room fell silent, a painful silence, because everyone understood if it were anyone else, this matter would have been buried from the very first minute. Rebecca nodded, but her face showed shame. "We understand, sir." Thomas looked at Marcus, the executive assistant who had run over earlier. "Mr. Marcus, you know the policy regarding serious discrimination in our facilities, right?" Marcus nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Under Horizon's 4A service code, any evidence of clear discrimination will result in the suspension of the entire team involved, pending a high-level investigation, and, if a violation is confirmed, it will result in immediate termination." Brett's gasp was as loud as breaking glass. Sophia put her hand to her mouth, her heart pounding, but Thomas spoke gently. "I don't want to ruin anyone's life. None of them are born bad. It's just moments like this expose what people don't want to face." He took a deep breath. "If the company has rules, follow them, whatever the outcome." Rebecca bowed her head. "We will, but the question that no one in the room was asking right now was whether Thomas asked for anything more. He has power, real power, and when someone like him wants to hurt someone, it only takes seconds to wipe out a person's life. But Thomas Carter was not that kind of person." After a few seconds of silence, He said, "I want to add one more thing." Everyone's heart sank. Brett nearly fainted. Linda gripped Evan's hand, her nails digging into his skin. "When you do internal investigations, I want all employees to have their voices heard," Thomas said. "Don't judge them based on one bad moment." Sophia froze, tears welling up in her eyes. Thomas continued, "And I also want all passengers involved to be recorded so the airline can decide whether they are still up to the ethical standards of using VIP services." Linda almost jumped up at that. "You can't do this to me." Jenna looked straight at her. "We absolutely can. And by regulation, a passenger who makes a seriously discriminatory statement can be banned from VIP service for 24 months or more." Linda paled. Evan put his hand on her shoulder, but he was shaking too. Thomas looked straight at them. "I don't want you two grounded. I don't want to ruin anyone's life. I just want this to be handled fairly." The whole room let out a sigh of relief, but that kindness hurt them more than any harsh sentence, because Thomas's kindness only exposed their pettiness. Rebecca stood up straight, as if she had just received a mission from a higher authority. "We will do as you ask." Thomas nodded slightly. "Then I'm relieved. A new tension appears, softer, but deeper." Then he turned to Sophia, startling her. "Miss Lee." Sophia stood up straight at once, her hands still shaking slightly. "Yes, sir." "You said the best thing in this room," Thomas said softly. "You suggested checking tickets. A simple sentence, but it's what a service person needs most to think before judging." Sophia's eyes were red. I'm sorry I didn't stand up stronger." Thomas shook his head. "Don't apologize for that. A person with a conscience learns from mistakes. I see that in you." A tear fell from the corner of Sophia's eye. She tried to hold it back, but couldn't. Then he looked at Brett. But this time, the look wasn't accusing. It was just sad. A deep sadness of someone who understood that Brett was the product of a twisted culture he didn't have the courage to escape. "Mr. Coleman," Thomas said softly, "I don't hate you, but you have to face the truth. No one loses anything by respecting another. But when you look down on a person, sometimes the price you pay is your career." Brett bowed his head, speechless. His jaw twitched. All his years of climbing the corporate ladder collapsed in minutes. Thomas looked back at Rebecca. "I want to continue waiting for my flight. If possible, I want to sit here and read until boarding time. I don't need any other priorities." Rebecca almost collapsed in shame. "Sir, this lounge belongs to you. You can ask for anything." Thomas shook his head. "No, I just want things to go back to normal." But the whole room understood that after today, nothing would be normal again. A few minutes later, as the employees began to file out to the work area to await a decision on the investigation, Sophia had only taken a few steps when she heard Thomas call her back. "Miss Lee." She turned back, her eyes red and shiny. "Yes." Sir Thomas smiled slightly. "Thank you for trying to do the right thing, even if it was just for a moment." She covered her mouth and nodded repeatedly. Thank you." Thomas looked at her with encouraging eyes. "Don't let anyone extinguish that good intuition." And then he returned to his chair and continued turning the page, as if the storm had never passed. But everyone knows the next chapter of the storm is just beginning. After Rebecca and the executive team left the lounge for an emergency meeting with the investigation department, the LuxPort Elite Lounge fell into a strange kind of silence, no longer explosively tense as before, but not peaceful either. It was as if a storm had just passed, leaving a thin layer of dust in its wake. Some of the passengers were talking softly to each other, but only enough to create rustling whispers like tree branches rubbing against each other in the breeze. Thomas sat in his original chair, the same old book, the same calm gaze, but there was something deeper in those eyes. Not anger, not hurt, like that very human weariness, the kind that comes when you're so used to having to prove you belong somewhere you were supposed to belong in the first place. In the distance, Sophia stood by the counter. She glanced at Thomas several times, but did not dare to approach. Guilt and gratitude mixed together. She did not know what to do. Brett had been taken to a private room, his face pale. Evan and Linda Prescott were still sitting in their VIP seats, but without their usual arrogance. Linda bowed her head slightly, her hand shaking as she held her glass of water, while Evan looked out the window, as if trying to escape the room. Some passengers in the lounge, after understanding what was going on from the conversations they overheard, began to whisper, "Who is he, Thomas Carter? That name sounds familiar. I think he's one of the big investors. This airline seems to respect him a lot. More than that, I heard he holds a powerful seat on the board, and they dare to fire him because of the color of his skin." The words dripped into the air, spreading like ink on paper. Each person spoke a sentence. Each sentence was like a needle touching an old wound in Thomas's heart. But Thomas kept reading, still calmly, as if he had gotten into the habit of not letting the outside world determine his worth. A young waiter, Noah, approached, looking confused. "Mr. Carter, would you like some more tea or coffee?" Thomas looked up, smiling gently. "Thanks, but I'm fine." Noah nodded, bowing slightly, but he paused for a few seconds, as if he wanted to say something. Thomas guessed, "What's up?" Noah took a deep breath. "I just want to say, I'm sorry for what happened. I know my apology doesn't change anything, but I just feel ashamed to be here when it happened." Thomas put down his book. "Noah, it's not your fault, and I don't have to carry the burden of things that aren't mine." Noah bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "Yes, thank you." He left, but his steps were light, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. A moment later, Sophia stood behind the counter, watching the scene. Her heart clenched. She didn't run over right away. Questions rang through her head. Why didn't I protect him more strongly? Why did I stay silent when things got so out of hand? Why did I let Brett push me in the wrong direction? The truth was, she knew why. Because she was afraid of losing her job, because she was afraid of Brett, because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to cope. Fear was no excuse, but it kept her silent, and that silence lasted a moment she could not get back. Across the room, Linda Prescott finally stood up. Evan grabbed her wrist. "Linda, don't be naughty. Why do you keep—" "I have to apologize to him," Linda said in a small but firm voice. "Evan, we've gone too far." Evan sighed, but he knew his wife was no longer proud. There was genuine fear in her voice. Linda walked towards Thomas. No one stopped her, but all eyes followed, even Sophia's. As she approached, Linda paused for a few seconds. "Mr. Carter, I want to talk to you." Thomas looked up. "Yes." Linda swallowed. "I'm sorry for what I said and for everything I did." Thomas looked into her eyes, but said nothing. Linda continued, "I have no excuse, no reason, and I don't expect your forgiveness. I just have to say it." Thomas remained silent for another beat, then said softly, "Mrs. Prescott, you don't owe me an apology. What you owe is yourself." Linda's eyes widened. Thomas continued, soft but sharp as a cut of truth. Sometimes words hurt not just because they offend, but because they reveal something the speaker doesn't want to see. "It's not me who's hurt by your words. It's you." Linda's hands trembled. "You're right." Thomas nodded. "Thank you for your apology." Linda turned away without saying anything more. Evan stood up to help her up, and the two of them left the VIP area, so quietly that no one realized they had been the loudest people in the room. At the bar, Sophia wiped her glass with a shaking hand. She had just witnessed something that twisted her heart. A once arrogant woman learning to bow her head, a once humiliated man standing firm with tolerance, and Sophia felt deeply that she needed to do the same. She took a deep breath, then stepped closer to Thomas, her heart beating fast. "Mr. Carter." Her voice almost choked. I would like to speak to you." Thomas closed the book slightly. "Go ahead." Sophia stood before him, her hands clasped together as if to keep them from shaking. "What happened earlier was my fault. I saw the difference in your ticket. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to say it more forcefully." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. "I should have done more. I should have stood between that injustice and protected him. But I didn't." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then tilted his head slightly. "Miss Lee, why do you think you have to be perfect?" Sophia looked up, confused. I don't know. All humans make mistakes," Thomas said slowly. "The important thing is whether we are honest enough with ourselves to grow from those mistakes." Sophia bit her lip. Will you forgive me?" Thomas smiled gently, softening the room. "I don't need forgiveness. I was never angry with you." Sophia burst into tears. Tears fell onto the clean tiled floor of the lounge, but each one seemed to wash away a layer of heaviness from her heart. Thomas continued, "Keep that sensitivity you have. Not many people have that. Don't let anyone extinguish it." Sophia nodded vigorously, as if taking each word to heart. A moment later, Noah brought Thomas a new glass of water, unsolicited. He set it down gently on the table. "I know you don't want anything else, but I think you need some water." Thomas looked at him, knowing it was a small but sincere act. The room had changed. It was no longer a place filled with whispers of privilege and power. It was more like a silent classroom where everyone was learning a lesson that wasn't in the textbook, and that lesson came from a black man sitting quietly reading a book. But its impact spread across the room like sunlight through glass. Outside the window, the afternoon sun began to slant, spreading across the runway like a golden carpet. A boarding signal sounded in the distance, but no one paid any attention. They were still too busy looking at themselves through Thomas's image. The afternoon sun outside was slowly turning honey-colored as the LuxPort Elite Lounge sank into a strangely hushed silence. What had happened earlier still lingered like a ripple on the water's surface. Most people kept their distance, both awed and curious, but no one wanted to break the solemn atmosphere. Thomas was still sitting in the same place, the book open, but his eyes were more absent-minded than usual. It wasn't that he was nervous, he was just thinking about the repetitions of life, about the cycles that pull a person back to the same starting point no matter how far he has traveled. He wondered, does discrimination ever really end? Or does it just change shape over time? Suddenly, Thomas's phone vibrated. The screen lit up with the words, "Summit Ascend Capital, Executive Board." A call only appears in truly important moments. Thomas raised an eyebrow, stood, and walked to a quieter area, near the glass wall that overlooked the runway. The light reflected off his face, highlighting his experienced yet strong features. He pressed accept. "This is Thomas." "Raymond Porter, president of Summit Ascend," said in a deep voice. "Thomas, I just received an urgent report from Horizon Airlink. Are you okay?" Thomas chuckled lightly. "I'm fine. It's just a slightly familiar situation." Raymond sighed on the other end of the line. "We're in 2025 and things like this are still happening. It's unfair and unprofessional. Do you want me to intervene directly?" Thomas looked out at the runway, where a plane was being towed into position for takeoff. "No need. Raymond, I told them to handle it according to procedure. No more." Raymond was surprised. "You are always like that, so kind that I don't know whether to praise or blame you." Thomas was silent for a few seconds before answering. "If I act out of power, then what difference am I to them?" Raymond smiled sadly. "You are always right in a way that makes others think twice about themselves." Then he changed his tone, becoming more serious. "But Thomas, there's something I need you to know. The Horizon Board of Directors called me. They said this was no ordinary incident. It caused a huge stir internally, and that will lead to more drastic decisions." Thomas frowned slightly. "I don't want anyone's life ruined by a few minutes of error. I don't want the company to overreact." Raymond responded immediately. "No one is talking about retaliation. But, Thomas, According to Summit Ascend's policy when it comes to senior board members, all relevant units are required to undergo a reevaluation of operating standards, and the preliminary results show the Denver Lounge team has accumulated violations over a long period of time. Thomas looked back at the room through the glass. The staff were still keeping their distance, no one calm enough to talk. Only Sophia, her eyes watching from afar, was still filled with emotion that Thomas could read. He spoke slowly. "Raymond, you're saying this isn't just about today," Raymond replied in a heavy voice. "Yes, and we only found out today because you were the one affected. You know what I mean?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. A deep sadness crept through his chest. He knew better than anyone that sometimes, only when power is violated, wrongdoing is revealed. Raymond continued. "The council asked me to inform you before they made their decision, since you have the power to veto this matter." Thomas opened his eyes and looked toward Brett, who was isolated in the small room. The man's face was pale and trembling, as if he were awaiting his fate. Thomas asked quietly, "What are they going to do?" Raymond answered bluntly, "Fire the entire lounge staff, from the manager to the waiters, including Brett, Sophia, the support team, all of them. The decision is effective immediately, unless you object." The words fell on Thomas like a huge rock. He turned to look at Sophia, who had just stood up to admit her mistake, crying in self-pity. Then he looked at Noah, the honest young employee, who clearly had nothing to do with the wrongdoing. Thomas saw in their eyes fear, confusion, and a small hope that he wouldn't let them lose everything. He said softly, almost to himself, "Even those who have done nothing wrong must be punished." Raymond replied, "No fine, but the company has to be reset to prevent this from happening again. The old system is rotten. We can't patch things up anymore." Thomas was silent. He understood that it made sense, but his heart ached. Raymond continued, his voice soft but clear. "Thomas, this decision will not be made without your consent. You are the only one on the council with the power to stop it." Thomas stepped closer to the glass, looking down at the long, straight runway. The plane was still taxiing slowly. The sunlight swept across its metal, making it shine like a silver arrow. He thought back to his childhood, of the times he was yelled at for sitting in the wrong seat in the old airport waiting area, of being pulled out of line because he didn't look like someone with a high-class ticket, of being seen as not belonging to that world, even though he tried 10 times harder than everyone else. And he understood a business cannot just fix individuals, it must fix the whole system. But you can't use a sledgehammer to fix every small crack, Raymond asked, his voice low. "Thomas, the final decision is yours." There was a long silence, long enough for one to feel one's own heartbeat. Finally, Thomas replied, "I will not let innocent employees lose their jobs, but I will not let the old system continue to exist." "Raymond, what do you mean?" "Thomas, I want to see the whole report, and I will personally go down and evaluate every single person, every single process, a real rebuild, not tearing it all down, but not keeping the rottenness either." Raymond breathed a sigh of relief. "I knew you would choose that path. I always do." Thomas smiled, though it was a tired smile. "Thank you for calling," Raymond whispered before hanging up Thomas. "Whatever you do, we stand behind you." Call ended. Thomas stood there for a few more seconds, his eyes deeper, calmer, as if he had just rebuilt the line between justice and kindness in his heart. When he returned to the lounge, Sophia stood up quickly, thinking he needed something. Noah also turned to him, looking worried. A few passengers looked at him, not knowing what had just happened but sensing the change in his demeanor. Thomas walked straight back to his chair, sat down again, and put the book on the table. No one knew that in the next few hours, one decision of his would determine the future of this entire lounge. But there is one thing everyone feels: Thomas Carter was not just the victim of an injustice, He is becoming the man who will change the system that allows that injustice to exist. And that's just the beginning of what's to come. When Thomas returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the LuxPort Elite Lounge was still tense. No one could hear the conversation that had just taken place on the phone, but they could clearly sense that something extremely important was moving beneath the quiet surface. The passengers in the room began to whisper to each other, though they tried to keep their voices low. I think he's talking to a very high level. Maybe the board, maybe even higher. Thomas put the book down on the table and took a slow, deep breath. He wasn't in a hurry, he wasn't angry, but there was a thoughtful glint in his eye, like someone trying to balance the two ends of a scale, justice and kindness. Sophia watched him from the counter, her heart beating strangely fast. Something about Thomas made her want to get closer, to understand, to help fix her own mistake. But she stood still, as if afraid one wrong move would ruin the moment. Noah stood in the corner, glancing at Brett, who was sitting alone in the makeshift waiting room. Brett held his head, his panic evident. Noah didn't hate Brett, but he couldn't pity him either. He only saw a man facing his own true consequences. About 5 minutes passed. Then the door to the lounge's executive room opened. Rebecca Owens stepped forward, her face stern but with a hint of worry in her eyes. Behind her were Jenna Morales and Harold Kim, both carrying folders and laptops. They looked like they had just finished an urgent meeting that had no time to rest. Rebecca walked straight up to Thomas. "Mr. Carter, we have contacted senior management and have been instructed to report back on the situation immediately. And a new decision has been made." The whole room was silent. Thomas looked at her calmly. "I guess so." Rebecca swallowed, her eyes showing her awkwardness. Before announcing the official decision, they asked for final confirmation from you. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." Harold opened his laptop, his voice solemn. After reviewing all footage, testimony, and Horizon Airlink's policies, the Summit Ascend Restructuring Committee recommends suspending the entire lounge team and starting from scratch. No exceptions. Those words made the whole room freeze. Sophia took a step back. Noah bit his lip. The new employee, who had been on the job for only a few months, was starting to tremble. Even the passengers who were just watching took in a deep breath. Thomas didn't react. He just looked at Rebecca, waiting for her to continue. Rebecca tried to keep her voice calm, but the board recommends adding that any such action will only be taken with Mr. Carter's consent, since the incident directly involves him. Jenna slid the file toward Thomas. "We need your decision, either verbally or in writing." Sophia couldn't take it anymore. She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Carter, please think about the people who weren't involved. I don't want to lose this job, but more importantly, I don't want the people who tried to do the right thing to get dragged into it." Thomas turned to look at Sophia. His gaze was neither cold nor distant, just peaceful. "What do you think is fair, Miss Lee?" he asked softly. Sophia bit her lip. I don't know. I just know that justice doesn't always mean everyone gets punished." Thomas nodded slightly. "You're right." Rebecca stood beside him, feeling the pressure of this decision multiply. "Mr. Carter, we don't want to put you in a difficult position, but this is a request from the parent corporation." Thomas flipped through the file but didn't read it. "Rebecca, I don't need to see the paperwork. I know what I need to do." All held their breath. He stood up, not in a hurry, not dramatically, but his presence was so strong that people automatically made room for him. He spoke in a deep, clear voice, not loud but strong enough to echo throughout the room. "I do not agree to fire the entire lounge staff." A gasp was heard somewhere. Sophia covered her mouth, tears welling up. Noah bowed his head, trying to hide his emotions. Some of the other staff members were on the verge of tears. Thomas looked at them, then at Rebecca. But the word "but" falls like a warning. The room held its breath again. Thomas continued. "Over the years, I have learned that it is the system that makes mistakes, not just people. I will not let innocent people pay the price for the mistakes of a few individuals." He paused for a few seconds to let everyone understand. "But we will not let negligence continue." Rebecca nodded slightly, eyes wide as if taking in every word. Thomas took another half step forward. "I demand an independent evaluation of each employee. Those at fault are held accountable. Those who are not at fault are retained and retrained." Harold tilted his head. "An independent review, meaning the entire team will be looked at individually." Thomas replied, "Yes. Fairness must go hand in hand with transparency." Sophia wiped away her tears. They were not tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief. Jenna repeated for confirmation. "So you are formally opposing the decision to fire everyone and requesting an individual evaluation process instead, is that correct?" Sir Thomas nodded. "Yes." Rebecca breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I will pass the message along to the board." But Thomas raised his hand, making her stop. "I'm not finished yet." The air froze instantly. Thomas looked toward the small room where Brett was sitting. "There are obvious violations that need to be addressed without delay." Brett's throat tightened. "Not because I was offended," Thomas continued, "but because he demonstrated systematic favoritism, pride in his authority, and created an environment where others felt they were not allowed to do the right thing." All eyes turned to Brett. Thomas concluded, his voice calm but sharp. "Therefore, I request that Brett be immediately suspended pending investigation." Rebecca nodded vigorously. "That makes perfect sense. We'll take care of it right away." No one objected. Thomas turned to Sophia. "Miss Lee, I see goodness in you, but you need to learn to stand up when you see something wrong. Today is a lesson, not a judgment." Sophia nodded, choking up. "I will never forget." Thomas looked around the room. "I want to know how everyone is evaluated. I will be accountable to Summit Ascend for my recommendations." Harold bowed his head. "Yes, sir." Then Thomas sat back down and gently opened the book. A simple act, but it felt like a confirmation that everything was in place. The silence changed from tense to respectful. A few staff members furtively wiped away tears. Some passengers looked at Thomas with new eyes, not just awe, but admiration. Sophia returned to the counter, feeling much lighter. She knew she still had a chance to become a better person. And the truth is, no one in the lounge that day was as indifferent as when they entered, after Thomas made the decision to independently evaluate each employee. The atmosphere in the lounge seemed to calm down, but no one dared to consider it the end. In fact, it was just the first door that opened to bigger, deeper developments that no one had anticipated. Outside the window, the Denver sky was turning a pale blue, a few streaks of white cloud streaking across it like soft dashes. Planes were still taking off and landing regularly, but here in the LuxPort Elite Lounge, time seemed to run slower than usual, because everyone is waiting to see what happens next. One of the support staff approached Rebecca and whispered something. Rebecca paused, her face tense as if something serious had happened. She turned to look at Thomas and quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Carter," she said softly but clearly. "The CEO of Horizon Airlink is here." The whole lounge fell into a hush of silence. Noah's eyes widened. Sophia raised her hand to her chest and took a deep breath. The other employees looked at each other, seemingly unable to believe that this incident had involved the head of the airline. Several passengers stood back, standing to the sides, as if preparing to watch some solemn hearing. Thomas kept his face as calm as a lake. "I understand," he replied. A few minutes later, the automatic door opened, and Horizon Airlink CEO Marcus Hill walked in. He was dressed in a navy suit, tall, broad-shouldered, and had a stern face. His eyes were as sharp as someone who had lived through too many crises in the aviation industry. But when he saw Thomas, his attitude changed immediately. He stepped forward quickly, held out his hand, and bowed slightly. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for this terrible incident. I flew from Dallas to Denver as soon as I received the report. All the staff in the lounge were shocked. They had never seen the CEO of an airline apologize to a customer like that. So direct, so quick, and so clear." Thomas stood up and shook his hand. "Thank you for coming, Marcus, but I don't think it's serious enough for you to fly back." Marcus shook his head. "It's not just serious, Thomas, it's unacceptable." The way he called Thomas by his first name suggested they were no strangers. Perhaps they had met at senior executive events. This added to the staff's tension. Marcus turned to the entire lounge, especially the staff huddled near the counter. "Everyone, I need you to know what happened today was not just a minor incident. It was a sign of systemic failure." Sophia bowed her head, tears falling again. Noah clenched his fists. Another employee gasped as if about to faint. Marcus continued. "I watched the whole video. I watched how Brett treated Mr. Carter, how he made decisions, and worse, how others didn't dare to stop him and didn't dare to speak up." Rebecca shivered slightly. She understood Marcus was talking about work culture, not individual infractions. Marcus turned back to Thomas and said sincerely, "Thomas, you showed a kindness that not everyone has in that situation. But I hope you understand, if I don't act firmly, this kind of thing will continue." Thomas looked Marcus in the eye and said, "I respect that, but I have made my decision. I don't want the entire staff fired." Some people burst into tears of relief, others almost collapsed from the release of tension. Marcus nodded. "I heard from Rebecca, and I agree with your approach." The whole lounge was stunned. The respect between the two men was deafening. Marcus walked over and looked at each employee one by one. His eyes were sharp but not cruel, like someone searching for the truth in each gaze. He stopped in front of Sophia. "Miss Lee, I looked at the footage. I saw hesitation. I saw you knew something was wrong but didn't have the courage to stop it. But I also saw you weren't complicit. You didn't hate anyone. You were just afraid." Sophia choked. "Sir, I'm sorry," Marcus said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't need to apologize to me. But from today, if you want to continue working in the service industry, you have to learn to stand up for what is right, even if what is right is not easy." Sophia nodded vigorously, her eyes wet but determined. Marcus walked over to Noah. "Noah, you were the only one that day who tried to do the right thing, even if you weren't strong enough." Noah blushed and bowed his head. I just did what I thought I should do." "And you did the right thing," Marcus said. "You will be placed in the firm's junior leadership training program." Noah looked up, stunned. "Really?" Marcus chuckled. "Those who dare to act for justice are the ones we want to keep." The atmosphere seemed to change. The heaviness from earlier now turned to expectation and hope. But it wasn't over yet. Marcus turned to Brett, who was being led out of the small room, his face ashen. "Brett Coleman," Marcus called. "Do you have anything to say?" Brett stammered, his voice weak. I didn't mean to. I thought," Marcus cut in, not needing to hear more. "No need to explain. I saw the video. You didn't just make a mistake. You believed in it, and that's dangerous." Brett held his head, tears streaming down his face. I will lose everything," Marcus said bluntly, not coldly, but not indulgently. "Mistakes can be corrected, but attitudes are difficult. You will be suspended and put into a formal investigation process. The final decision will be based on the results." Sophia turned away, not daring to look. Noah also felt uncomfortable. Thomas looked at Brett for a few more seconds, then whispered to Marcus, "Firing isn't always the solution." Marcus nodded, understanding Thomas's meaning. "I know, and that's why we're going to get to the bottom of this." Marcus then turned back to Thomas. "Mr. Carter, I have a proposal." Thomas was silent, waiting. We want you to be part of Horizon's advisory board in restructuring service standards, not because you are a victim of this incident, but because your vision is exactly what the airline industry is lacking." The lounge almost exploded into silence. Even Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise. Thomas looked at Marcus, considering for a few seconds. "I'll think about it." "We will wait," Marcus replied, "and we hope you agree." No words followed, but everyone understood. That moment marked a major turning point, not just for the lounge, but for Horizon Airlink. A new chapter is opening, not by a fit of rage, but by one man who chose to rise with calmness, humanity, and rare inner strength. The night sky slowly descended on Denver like a thick velvet blanket, stretching past the airport's glass windows. The soft yellow light reflected off the polished stone floors of the LuxPort Elite Lounge, making it feel like an oasis from the noisy world outside. After a tense and emotional conversation with Marcus Hill, Thomas left the lounge for a moment to get some air, but he returned less than 10 minutes later, knowing full well that this was far from over. In the corner of the room, a group of employees still stared at Thomas with a mixture of hope and gratitude. The appearance of the airline CEO and his words still left them stunned, but it was the offer to Thomas that truly made them feel both admiration and a strange kind of trust. The atmosphere had barely stabilized when Rebecca Owens quickly stepped forward, her face showing unprecedented tension. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "we have a new problem, and perhaps you should know." Thomas looked into her eyes, knowing something was up. "What's wrong?" "Rebecca." She glanced toward the back door. "There's someone who wants to see you, and they say they have information about the management of this lounge. Information that, if true, means things are more serious than we thought." Thomas frowned slightly, who Rebecca lowered her voice. "Marcus Hill let him in, and I think this is no ordinary employee." Thomas nodded and followed Rebecca to the small conference room behind the lounge. The door opened slightly. Inside, a man in his 40s sat waiting, wearing a silver-gray shirt, slim but extremely alert. He stood up as soon as Thomas entered. "Hello, Mr. Carter. I am Damian Ward, Senior Independent Inspector for Horizon Airlink." Thomas shook his hand, his face calm but his eyes piercing as if he were trying to read the man before him. "I heard your name. Damian. What do you want to discuss?" Damian opened his bag, took out a tablet, and placed it on the table. "I've seen all the footage, and I think you need to know that what happened today was no accident. It was the product of a series of actions that spanned months, even years." Thomas sat down, listening slowly. "You mean there is abuse in the system?" Damian nodded slowly. "It wasn't just abuse of power. It was organized favoritism, VIP seat allocation decisions, priority lists, and even some internal processes were manipulated by a few individuals within the lounge team." Thomas mused, not surprised but not happy about it. "And Brett is one of the leaders." Damian opened another file on the screen. "It's not just Brett. He's the most visible. But there's also Linda Prescott and someone we haven't identified yet in middle management." Thomas leaned his arms on the table. "Go on." Damian leaned forward, his voice low. "From the camera data, internal reports, and some leaked emails, I'm certain that there was a group of employees who abused their authority to prioritize serving certain familiar customers while quietly eliminating customers they deemed unsuitable." Thomas's eyes flashed with a coldness that was rare to see. "Unsuitable, based on what criteria?" Damian replied without hesitation. "Based on race, clothing, appearance, and personal bias." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Rebecca stood behind him, her hands clasped together. The truth she had long suspected was now fully revealed before her. Thomas asked slowly, each word as clear as a knife. "So, today I'm just the next in line for those who will be treated like that?" Damian sighed. "Yes, and maybe more serious, because you are a man of influence. This incident only came to light because Brett was too confident in his authority." Thomas looked down at the table for a few seconds as a cold wind ran through his heart. Then he looked up. "Damien, what do you want me to do?" Damien looked Thomas straight in the eye. "Marcus Hill believes that only you, an influential outsider, can get this investigation to the bottom of things. If you agree to serve on the advisory board, we will have full authority to expand the review to the entire national lounge system." Rebecca almost held her breath when she heard that. Thomas did not answer immediately. He stood up, walked to the glass door of the conference room, and looked out at the runway lit by night lights. Planes lined up, each with a story, a life, a journey, waiting to take off. He spoke slowly, his voice warm but powerful. "I have spent my life proving that black people can stand in positions of power without shouting, without destroying, without retaliating. But sometimes, silence is a form of complicity." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she listened, because she knew Thomas was on the brink of a much bigger decision than today's lounge. Thomas turned back to Damien. "I will help you investigate, but I want two things." Damien nodded. "Go ahead." "First," Thomas said, "every innocent employee must be protected. No one should lose their job for no fault of their own." Damien made a quick note. "Of course." "Second," Thomas looked at him directly, "this investigation must be absolutely transparent. No cover-ups, no self-justification, no protecting the interests of any powerful individual." Damien smiled slightly. "Somewhat odd. I see. You want the whole truth." Thomas nodded. "Only the truth can rebuild a better system." After a few seconds of silence, Damien stood up, holding out his hand. "So, can I tell Marcus that you agree?" Thomas looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. "Okay. A light decision, but carries the weight of changing the direction of an entire airline." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with respect. "Carter, thank you for choosing this path." Thomas smiled slightly. "I was just doing what was right." "Rebecca?" Damien put his tablet away and left the conference room, leaving Thomas and Rebecca in silence. Rebecca, for the first time ever, spoke in a truly choked voice. "Mr. Carter, I have worked in this industry for over 25 years, but today is the first time I have seen a person with power choose to save the weaker people instead of using it to threaten." Thomas looked at her. "Not to save, just to remind us men can fail, but justice must not fail." The words rang out in the silence like an oath, and it signals that what's coming is bigger, deeper, and touches corners that people have previously ignored. Outside the windows, stars were beginning to appear sporadically in the black Denver sky. The planes were moving like dots of light in the distance, creating a feeling of both peace and distance. Night had fallen, but in the LuxPort Elite Lounge, the alertness was brighter than any runway light. Thomas left the conference room after his conversation with Damien Ward. His steps were leisurely, but weighty. The staff in the lounge watched him as if they were watching the path of someone who could change their fate. Rebecca Owens walked beside him, saying nothing, but gratitude and respect were evident in every breath she took as she tried to keep calm. As they returned to the main lounge area, the atmosphere suddenly became stagnant, not because of Thomas, but because of someone waiting in the middle of the room. Linda Prescott. She stood right in front of the granite pillar, her eyes both bold and nervous. Despite her efforts to maintain confidence, Linda's demeanor showed she knew what was coming, and it wasn't gentle. Thomas paused. Rebecca leaned toward him, as if asking for permission to handle the situation. But Thomas just gestured, "Let me." Linda stepped forward, her high heels clicking softly on the floor. "Mr. Carter, I heard that there is an investigation being prepared. I would like to speak to you directly." Thomas looked at her, his eyes non-judgmental but not indulgent either. "Go ahead." Linda took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "First, I want to make it clear I did not participate in any discriminatory actions. What happened today was Brett's fault, not mine." Noah stood nearby, squeezing her hand gently. Sophia looked over with a mixture of anger and pity in her eyes. Thomas asked softly, his voice as calm as a lake. "Are you sure?" Linda swallowed. I was just following procedure. I didn't mean to exclude anyone from service." Thomas did not answer at once. He looked at her in silence, the look of a man who had heard too many excuses in his lifetime. Just then, Damian Ward returned to the lounge, holding a new file. When he saw Linda, he stopped. "Linda Prescott," Damian said, his voice quiet but clear. "We've looked at the internal data, and there's something you should hear." Linda turned around, her voice becoming defensive. "I did nothing wrong." Damian set the file down on a nearby table. "Over the past 6 months, you've approved over 30 changes to service priority. They all have the same pattern. The customers who were downgraded were all minorities. And over 70% of the customers who were upgraded were customers you knew or had a personal connection to." A ripple of excitement spread through the room. Linda paled, but still tried to act tough. "It's a coincidence no one can confirm." Damian opened his tablet. "There was an email from you to Brett. Make sure the right people are in the VIP area, not people who don't look like our customers." Sophia gasped. Rebecca held her forehead. Noah let out a frustrated breath. Linda stammered, That's not what I meant. I just said." Thomas took a half step forward, his voice low but strong enough to silence the room. "Miss Prescott, do you know that saying that adds another brick to the wall of prejudice in the service industry?" Linda looked at him, her eyes red. "You don't understand. I'm just trying to do my job well. I'm under pressure from powerful VIPs, and I have to prioritize them to keep the lounge running." Thomas cut her off, but didn't shout. He spoke with a pained calm. "I understand pressure. I've lived under pressure all my life. But pressure doesn't give you the right to decide who's right based on looks or ethnicity." Linda stood still, her lip trembling, her confidence completely shattered. But Thomas saw her not as an enemy, but as someone who had been lost for too long. "Linda," he said slowly, "if you want to protect yourself, start by telling the truth." The statement was like a direct blow. Linda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her shoulders trembled slightly. Rebecca stepped forward and placed her hand on Linda's arm. "We'll handle this properly, but you need to cooperate." Linda no longer resisted. She lowered her head. For the first time since meeting Thomas Thye, "I will cooperate." Damian nodded and signaled to the 2 escorts. Linda followed, her figure shrinking, like a disoriented shadow. As the staff room door closed, the atmosphere in the lounge softened, but in a sadder, more reflective way. There was no anger or tension. There was only an understanding that what had just been revealed was not just the fault of one person. Sophia walked closer to Thomas. "Mr. Carter, I never thought it would go this deep." Thomas found a seat and leaned back. "Problems like this are always deeper than we think. We only see the surface." Noah sat nearby, looking suddenly older. "Do you think more will come out?" Thomas looked at him with a gentle but practical look. "I think we're just getting started." There was a long moment of silence. It wasn't heavy, but it was thoughtful. Rebecca walked over and sat down in the chair opposite Thomas. "Mr. Carter, I want to ask you something." Thomas nodded slightly. "Go ahead. Why? Are you still so calm when the truth is so unfair, when you are the one who is being wronged?" The staff around her stopped and listened. The question wasn't just for Rebecca, it was for everyone who has ever felt small in the face of social injustice. Thomas looked down at the table for a few seconds. He twirled the pen between his fingers, as if thinking of the distant past. "Because I can't let anger define me," he said quietly. "I've been angry a lot in my life, but then I realized if I become a person who only acts on emotions, I will lose to the very people who tried to put me down." The room was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioner. "I choose to react differently." Thomas continued. "I choose to make change, little by little, patiently, scientifically, and not let hatred blind me." Rebecca sighed, relieved. "Mr. Carter, you make us want to change with you." Thomas looked at her, smiling softly. "That's how real change begins. Not through punishment, but through awakening." That sentence made the space seem brighter even though the night was deep. In the corner of the room, Damian Ward turned and walked slowly toward Thomas. "Linda's interrogation will last several hours," he said, "but what she has just admitted has opened up a bigger picture. Perhaps someone higher up knew, or allowed this to grow." Thomas looked at him, calm, but sharp, I guess so. Damian opened his tablet, showing him some system reports. "Tomorrow, we'll explore the next part." Thomas nodded, his eyes deepening, "and I will be there." It wasn't quite dawn yet when the first rays of morning light filtered through the giant glass windows of Denver Airport. The cool, soft, blue light of the Rockies seeped into the LuxPort Elite Lounge, casting a light blanket of awareness over the leather chairs and stone floors. Thomas returned to the lounge early. Most of the staff hadn't arrived yet, but Rebecca Owens was there, along with Damian Ward, the independent inspector who looked like he'd been up all night. Damian stood in front of a makeshift electronic board in the corner of the room. Data, charts, and internal emails were projected onto the screen. The numbers were flashing back and forth so fast that it was difficult for a normal person to follow. Rebecca looked at Thomas with obvious tension. "Mr. Carter, we have to get started. What Damian found out last night—" She paused as if she didn't want to continue. Wasn't just limited to the lounge team. Thomas put his briefcase down on the table. "I guessed. Let's get started." Damian turned around, his eyes tired but sharp as a knife. "We found evidence that some upper management knew about the discrimination in this lounge, but deliberately did not report it to avoid affecting operational performance." Thomas crossed his arms, his eyes stern. "Who?" Damian worked quickly, opening a file. A name appeared on the large screen, Harold Kim. Rebecca choked. "No way." "Harold. He's the most principled person on the executive team." Damian looked straight at Rebecca. "Yes, but he's also the one under the most pressure from his superiors to maintain his customer satisfaction ratings. And it seems he's chosen to sweep the problem under the rug rather than deal with it." Thomas kept his voice calm. "Evidence," Damian typed in a few commands. A string of emails popped up. One of them read, "Don't make a big deal out of it. Don't lose more VIP customers because of a few rigid procedures. We prioritize high-revenue customers. Don't focus too much on formal fairness. The lounge has to maintain its image first. I'll take care of the rest." Rebecca covered her face. "Oh my God, I worked with him for years." Thomas read each line of the email, not angry, not surprised, just the feeling he was used to this kind of truth. The biggest problems are often hidden by those in a position to hide. Damian turned off the screen. "We need to see Harold today. Marcus Hill has asked Mr. Carter to be present for questioning, not an official investigation, but a conversation Harold cannot avoid." Thomas asked. "Where is he?" "He'll be in the lounge in a few minutes," Rebecca whispered. Thomas took a deep breath, seemingly preparing himself for the confrontation that would not be easy. "Then we wait. No need to wait long." The door opened automatically. Harold Kim walked in, tall, with graying hair and a smart suit. He looked as if he knew what was coming, but tried to maintain the composure of a senior manager. "Thomas, Damian." Harold nodded. "Rebecca, I heard you had something to discuss." His voice was low, a little tired. Thomas watched the man for a few seconds before saying, "Yes, and I think you know some of it." Harold was silent for a beat. "Is it about Brett?" Damian answered bluntly. "Not just Brett." Harold paused slightly. "What do you mean?" Damian opened his tablet and projected the email onto the screen. The blue light shone on Harold's face, making him look even paler. Thomas spoke slowly, his voice not harsh, but with a weight that Harold could not avoid. "Harold, you knew what was going on in this lounge. You knew the bias, and you chose not to interfere." Harold closed his eyes, like someone who had just received a stab in the heart. I did it because I thought everything would be fine if I didn't cause any more trouble. I didn't think it would lead to what happened today. Thomas asked a question that was not big but heavy as a sledgehammer. When do you think injustice will disappear if no one confronts it? Harold opened his eyes and looked at Thomas. His gaze was both shameful and painful. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Thomas interrupted immediately. I understand the pressure, but pressure cannot be the reason for you to let injustice exist. The room fell silent. The air seemed thick. Damien stepped forward, placing a report in front of Harold. The entire Denver Lounge operation will be reevaluated, and you will be asked to speak before Horizon's disciplinary review board. Harold shivered slightly. What does that mean? Damien said bluntly. If you cooperate, you may only be demoted, but if you deny responsibility, you may lose everything. Harold sat down in his chair, his shoulders slumped. He looked at Thomas, his eyes tired and sad, like someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. Thomas. I'm sorry. Thomas replied in a very soft voice, but so deep that Harold had to bow his head. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to those who have been treated wrongly because of your decision. Harold nodded, pursing his lips as if trying to hold back tears. I will cooperate. Damien gathered the files. We'll start the process now, but I want you to know this. He looked straight at Harold. You're making this harder because you could have stopped it in the first place. Harold bowed his head, not arguing. Thomas stood up. Harold, we all make mistakes, but what defines a man is how he recovers from them. Harold looked at Thomas with a strangely grateful gaze. Thank you, Thomas. Although not everyone would say such words, Thomas simply replied, This is just the beginning. Rebecca stood beside him, saying nothing, but her eyes were different, less angry, more understanding, an understanding that carried with it a sense of regret and realization. In the distance, Sophia and Noah stood by the counter, quietly observing. Sophia whispered to Noah, Mr. Carter is unlike any leader I've ever met. Noah replied, not because he has power, but because he knows how to use it to restore justice, not to overthrow anyone. In that moment, a new atmosphere formed in the lounge, no more fear, no more tension. Instead, it felt like everyone was undergoing a necessary cleansing, painful, but enlightening. A voice rang out from behind Thomas. The council wants to see you as soon as this conversation is over. Marcus Hill appeared at the door. He looked at Harold, then at Thomas. Marcus's eyes suggested that the next part would be even more serious than today, but Thomas just nodded, unflinching. Okay, I'll come. The day has not yet begun, but the fight for truth has entered a new chapter. The 6th floor of Denver's Airport Operations Complex is a place few people go. It's not a place for passengers, nor is it a place where lounge staff hang out. It's cold, quiet, and feels isolated from the hustle and bustle of the airport. Marcus Hill led Thomas M. Carter into a conference room with clear glass panels that looked straight down onto the runway. The morning light reflected off the wooden tabletop, reflecting softly like a still lake. Inside the room, there were 3 people waiting. Angela Brooks, Regional Director of Human Resources, Michael Reeves, Vice President of Service Standards, and another man standing by the window, Edward Larson, a member of the Horizon Executive Board. All was silent when Thomas walked in. The space seemed to collapse, leaving only the sound of his footsteps. Marcus pulled out a chair for Thomas. Here we go. Michael opened his laptop, his voice calm but sharp. Carter, thank you for participating in this special exchange. We know what happened yesterday, and we also know that the situation has become more complicated since this morning. Thomas said nothing, just nodded slightly. Angela Brooks opened a file. We would like you to confirm a few details. First, the incident on the business class flight. Next, your forced removal from your VIP seat. And finally, the attitude of the lounge staff. Edward Larson remained standing by the window, looking down at the runway as if pondering something deeper than anything in the room. Thomas put his hands on the table. I will cooperate fully. But I want to say this first. I'm not here to punish individual. I want to fix the root cause. Michael Reeves stared at him. Where do you think the root lies? Thomas replied immediately, without a second thought. The system, not the people. Angela looked at Marcus, then turned to Thomas. This is a bit contrary to what many people think. Thomas tilted his head, his eyes deep and calm. When a system has no safeguards against bias, weak individuals will thrive, not because they are bad from the start, but because the system allows them to be bad. The room fell silent. The silence was not tense, but reflective. The council members did not expect Thomas to speak with such pedagogical calm. Marcus broke the silence with a light cough. Let's get into details. Angela read Brett Collins removed him from his seat because a white passenger had fewer membership points. Linda Prescott approved the priority change and appears to have done so many times before. Thomas looked at her, his eyes clear of anger. Yes. Michael changed his posture, his expression very serious. But you also understand, this kind of problem can cause great damage to the Horizon brand. Thomas asked softly, what are you really worried about? Is the brand, or the truth? The question made Michael stiffen. Edward Larson walked away from the window and toward the conference table. He was an unpredictable, quiet man who spoke only when necessary. Thomas, you're the only one in the room without an inside position at Horizon, he said in a low voice. You can speak the truth without being bound. Thomas looked straight at him. I always tell the truth, not because I am free, but because it is the only way for me to live rightly. Larson nodded, and he sat down. So, how do you think this should be handled? Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked out the window, where the plane was preparing to take off. The sound of the engines made the room vibrate slightly. After a few seconds, he returned. I think Horizon shouldn't respond in a calming down way. That just glosses over the problem. You need to re-engineer your processes, rebuild your priorities, unlock independent oversight, and, most importantly, he paused. Empower those who are willing to speak up, Angela asked. People like you, Thomas said softly. Not just me, employees, customers, anyone. Michael took a deep breath. Mr. Carter, you're asking us to change our entire operating structure. Thomas smiled slightly. I'm asking you to do the right thing. How much you change is your choice. Marcus leaned back in his chair, seeming proud that Thomas had said what he had wanted to say for a long time but had never had the chance. Edward Larson put his hands on the table. Thomas, I say this not as a manager, but as a man who has seen the truth buried. He looked deep into Thomas's eyes. You understand that your words will carry more weight than any report we can gather because you have experienced it. Thomas nodded. I understand. Larson continued, and you are willing to suffer the consequences of pushing for change. Thomas sat up straight. I have fought systems like this all my life. If I feared the consequences, I would have kept silent in the first place. Angela looked at him, her eyes softening. Carter, do you think you were treated this way because you were a black CEO? Thomas neither dodged nor softened the issue. He replied calmly, I don't think. I know. The air in the room seemed to stop. Thomas continued in a deep, calm voice. No one says it directly, but the eyes, the attitude, the small decisions, all have their own language. A language that black people in America must learn from a young age if they want to survive. Angela bowed her head. Her hands clasped. Michael clasped his hands in front of him. Mr. Carter, I want to ask you one last thing. If you had the power to make one single change to prevent this from happening again, what would you choose? Thomas looked at each person, then spoke clearly, slowly and firmly. I will change the way Horizon defines VIP, not by skin color, income or connections, but by character, fairness, and mutual respect. Larson laughed softly, not a sarcastic laugh, but a laugh of recognition. You say that like you've been thinking about it for decades. Thomas nodded. I lived in it for decades. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of agreement. Marcus looked at his watch. I think we're done gathering. But, Thomas. He leaned forward. The council has one more thing to tell you. Larson looked straight at him. Thomas. Horizon would like to invite you to be a special advisor on the National Customer Service Reform Program. Thomas was a little surprised, but didn't show it strongly. Why me? Angela smiled sadly, but sincerely. Because we need someone who is not driven by internal interests, someone who sees the truth, not avoiding it, someone with courage and heart. Thomas thought for a few seconds. The room waited. I will accept, he finally said, but only if I am allowed to tell the truth, even if you do not want to hear it. Larson replied immediately. We invited you for that very reason. The atmosphere in the room lightened, not exactly bright, but it felt like a new chapter was opening, not just for Horizon, but for everyone who had ever been deemed unfit. Marcus stood up. The meeting is over. Thomas, thank you. Thomas stepped out of the glass room. Below, the runway was still wide, and planes were still taking off, but inside him, something had changed. Not because of the offer, but because he knew the truth had finally found its way out. When Thomas stepped out of the glass conference room, the hallway still smelled of fresh wood mixed with the scent of early coffee from the staff area. The light from the glass doors fell gently on his shoulders, as if everything that had happened in the conference room was both a cleansing and a beginning. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, but because he felt he was carrying something larger than himself, something that was heavy as responsibility, yet light as hope. As the elevator opened, he saw the LuxPort Elite Lounge on the first floor. The atmosphere in the lounge seemed different from last night, and from any morning he had ever experienced here. The staff straightened their backs, their eyes stopped diverting, and, most strikingly, they seemed to be waiting for him. Rebecca Owens stepped forward first. Her voice was warm but trembling with emotion. Mr. Carter, we would like to hear a word from you. If you do, Thomas chuckled. So lightly, it was like a passing breeze. I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say. Sophia stood nearby, her hands clasped together, but her eyes bright, I think. You have a lot we should hear. Noah stood beside him, his head slightly bowed but his proud smile evident. You are the reason we still want to stand here. Thomas looked around. There were young faces, older faces, faces exhausted by the pressure, and faces experiencing for the first time the value of true justice. He nodded slightly, as if to his heart. Okay, then. Rebecca motioned for everyone to gather in a small semicircle in front of the reception desk. It was so quiet that you could hear the distant sound of suitcases being dragged and the echoing of airport loudspeakers. Thomas took a step forward, not standing on a podium, not using a microphone. He just stood within range so everyone could see him. Thank you all for being here. He began in a low, warm voice. The first thing I want to say is this. I am not a hero. I did not come here to fix all problems. He paused, letting the words sink in. I'm just lucky enough to not be afraid to tell the truth. Many employees nodded slightly, as if they were hearing someone speak for them. Thomas looked at them, his eyes not angry, but full of sympathy. I know you have worked in an environment where sometimes just one wrong decision from your superiors can cost you your job. I know there are times when you are afraid to speak up. I understand because I was once in that position. An elderly employee named Henry stood behind and whispered. That's right, Thomas continued. When I was young, I was rejected a lot even though I had enough qualifications, enough experience, and the reasons were never said. But I understand. You understand. It was in the looks, in the small gestures, in a series of technical reasons, and gradually we become accustomed to silence. He looked straight at Noah, but silence saves no one. Noah took a deep breath, his eyes slightly red. Thomas turned to everyone. I didn't come to put anyone out of work. I came to make sure that good people don't have to continue to put up with bad things. At that moment, the large window at the back of the lounge poured in a stronger beam of light. It illuminated his face, opening up the space. Rebecca took a deep breath. "Mr. Carter, your words today. It was like we were breathing again for the first time in years." Thomas smiled gently. "I know how that feels." He then shared the important news the Horizon Council has invited me to be a special advisor on the reform program. "That does not mean I have power over you, but I will stand by you." The staff looked at each other, their eyes filled with surprise and hope. Thomas said, each word clearly, "If any of you have ever felt wronged, ignored, seen as inappropriate, then from today you will no longer be alone." At that moment, no one said a word, but that silence was filled with emotion, like an invisible string tied between strangers, just by a simple promise. Sophia took a step forward, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Carter, thank you. Really." Thomas turned to Rebecca. "There's one more thing I would like to do, if you allow me." Rebecca nodded. "Of course." Thomas walked up to the reception desk. He placed his hands on the smooth, cool surface, as if feeling the history of the place. "I want to say hello to each of you. I want to know your names, and I want you to know I see you as people, not numbers or seats." And then he did one small action, but the impact is like a wave. Thomas walked down the counter, shaking hands with each employee, Henry, who had been there for more than 11 years. Jasmine, a young woman just finishing her first internship. Eric, the night clerk who was always judged by sales. Linda had been suspended. But the others looked at Thomas's actions as if they saw something they never thought possible in a CEO. Thomas looked at each of them as if they were the center of the world at that moment. Not a handshake, not a nod of authority, but real recognition. When he shook Noah's hand, he held it a beat longer. "Noah, I'm so proud of you for standing up." Noah shivered slightly. "I just want to do the right thing, and you did." It was Sophia's turn. Thomas looked at her with deep and gentle eyes. "Sophia, if it weren't for your frankness, everything might have been buried." Sophia bowed her head, tears flowing silently. I feel like I can't stay silent anymore. That is admirable courage." When the greeting round ended, the whole lounge seemed to be infused with new life. Rebecca whispered, "Mr. Carter, you just revived the team's spirit." Thomas looked around, his eyes distant but full of warmth. "No, they revived themselves. I just opened the door. Suddenly, Marcus Hill's phone rang in the distance. He hurried in, his face full of tension but also containing something of surprise. "Thomas, we have a new problem." Thomas turned back, silent for a second as if he knew this story wasn't over yet. "What's the matter?" Marcus brought the phone screen in front of him. "It's going viral. It's going viral. And I think it's going to change everything." A picture appears. Not a picture of Brett, or Linda, or the lounge. But it's a picture of Thomas, when he was asked to leave his VIP seat in the plane cabin. Full video recording included, and with thousands of angry comments. This is beyond the scope of Horizon, and it's becoming a national wave. Thomas stood still for a few seconds. Don't show fear, don't show anger. He just breathed lightly. "Well then," he said slowly, "it is time to tell the truth to the whole country." Within 3 hours of Thomas being asked to leave his VIP seat going viral on social media, everything at Denver Airport changed as if an invisible storm had passed. No wind, no rain, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if all of America was looking through a small door at the LuxPort Elite Lounge. On the TV in the corner of the room, news channels played back and forth. Images of the incident played over and over again of Thomas rising from his seat, His eyes, calm but heavy, of the white passenger stepping in to replace him, and of Thomas walking down the aisle, like a slow-motion replay of real injustice. Rebecca muted the TV and turned to Thomas. "Mr. Carter, I think you should be prepared. It's not just Horizon. The whole country wants to hear from you." Marcus Hill walked in shortly after, looking as nervous as if he had just run down the hall. "Thomas, NBC wants to interview you in person. CNN wants you to send a video. Social media is exploding. People are calling you the man stripped of his seat because of the color of his skin. But thousands are calling you a new symbol of calm and dignity." Thomas just sat in the leather chair, his hands clasped together, listening, not responding, not rushing. He took a deep breath, like someone trying to take things in with a clear mind, without letting his emotions get the better of him. "Marcus, I will tell you, but not to them first." Marcus frowned. If not to the press, then to whom Thomas stood up. To those who have seen this from the beginning. He looked around the lounge, the staff, the guests, the people here. "We start with the smallest truth before telling a nation." Rebecca let out a small breath, almost a tired laugh. "You're always like that, always starting from where the humans stand." Thomas nodded slightly, then walked toward the center of the lounge, where the space was open, bright, and people could see him best. Noah and Sophia stopped as soon as they saw him. The staff started to gather again, but this time not out of curiosity, but because they knew something very important was about to be said. Thomas stood among them, no microphone, no spotlight, just him and his real faces. "Perhaps," Thomas began, his voice low and warm, "you've seen the news." Some nodded, others looked down, as if the shame of the system was weighing down on them. But Thomas raised his hand gently. "I don't want any of you to feel guilty about this going viral. It's not your fault it's going viral. It's going viral because the truth has a power of its own." Sophia looked at him, her eyes red. "Aren't you angry, Mr. Carter?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Angry? Who wouldn't be angry when something they paid for and were entitled to keep is taken away from them? Who wouldn't be angry when they are considered inferior because of the color of their skin?" He paused, his deep eyes seeming to stare into the darkness of a multi-layered society. "But I learned one thing. If I let anger lead me, I will become its victim forever." Noah clenched his fists. "So now, what do you want to do?" Thomas stood up straighter, his voice rising but maintaining a dignified composure. "I want this to be more than just a viral video. I want it to be a mirror for each of us to look back at moments when we may have been silent or made the wrong choices." Marcus looked at Thomas as if he had just witnessed a leader born. "I will be in the media," Thomas continued, "but not to blame Horizon. I will tell the truth. I will say that I met great employees who stood up for what was right, who did not look the other way." Rebecca gently raised her hand to her chest, feeling her heart being squeezed by someone with emotion. "Change," Thomas said, "doesn't start with a corporate decision. It starts with people standing up to what's wrong." He looked at Sophia. "Like you." Sophia burst into tears at that moment, unable to hold back any longer. I think he deserves to be treated fairly." Thomas smiled gently. "That is what we all deserve." A voice came from the door. "Thomas." Everyone turned back. Edward Larson entered the lounge, his expression serious but not tense. "The media is waiting for you. They want an official statement. But," he paused, "we will not control what you say. We want you to say exactly what you believe." Thomas looked at Larson for a long moment. "I appreciate that." Larson nodded. "You don't need to protect Horizon with lies. The only thing you need to protect is the truth." The whole lounge was silent. Thomas walked towards the door, but then stopped, turned back to look at all the staff, the ones who had witnessed his humiliation, and also the ones who had witnessed him stand up strong. "I will speak for all of us," he said softly but firmly. And I will not let anyone be forgotten in this story, Noah said softly, almost in a whisper. We trust you. Thomas bowed slightly. Then I'll be going. He walked out of the lounge. No one said anything. They just watched his tall, dark figure move down the lighted corridor, the figure of a man, not of a victim, but of a man with a mission. The corridor was so long that each footstep sounded like the steady beat of a journey much greater than a small incident. As Thomas approached the media area, camera flashes reflected off his face. Reporters stood waiting, microphones raised. Marcus looked at Thomas one last time. Are you ready? Thomas let out a sigh. A lifetime. Then he stepped straight into the light. The atmosphere quieted down, and then the microphone started to be turned towards him. Mr. Carter, what do you have to say about being forced to leave the VIP seat just because you're black? Thomas looked into the camera, no anger, no trembling, just the truth wanting to be told. I want to say this, he began. This is not a story about a chair. This is a story about people, about dignity, about how we treat each other when no one knows we are being filmed. He paused, as if to give America a moment to catch its breath. And today, I do not stand here alone. I stand with the workers who have not been silent. I stand with those who believe that equality is not a privilege. It is a fundamental right. The flashlight flashes continuously. Thomas ended with a sentence as light as the wind, but as sharp as a knife that changed public opinion. If a chair can be taken away because of the color of your skin, it's time to change the whole room. No one said anything more. No need to say more, because the truth has been set free, and it is stronger than anyone. Thomas's story is about more than just having his chair taken away. It reflects a common reality in life. Injustice isn't always loud. Often, it happens in silence, in glances, in small decisions, and most of us have felt it at least once. What makes Thomas special is not that he is a CEO, but that he chooses to face injustice with calmness, dignity, and the belief that change must start with oneself. This is also the most profound lesson the story leaves us with. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can absolutely control how you react. Silence is not weakness, it is strength. Speaking up is not about fighting. Sometimes it is about leading the voiceless. And kindness is not a luxury. It is the foundation for a better community. No matter your age, you can be a little light in a dark room. Because sometimes, it only takes one person to do the right thing to change the whole system. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touches you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring you emotional and meaningful journeys like this. Thank you for being with us until the end.